Hello friends, welcome to Political Science and International Relations. In this lecture, we are going to study an important concept in international relations, diplomacy. We will discuss the meaning of diplomacy. We will discuss the significance of diplomacy in international relations. Apart from this, we will also study the 9 tracks of diplomacy. So this is the scope of this lecture. Okay, what is diplomacy? You would have come across this term while studying international news or international affairs in the newspaper or in the digital media. You would have also come across the term diplomats. Diplomat is an individual engaged in the activity diplomacy. In simple words, diplomacy is the activity by which a country maintains relations with the rest of the world. A country interacts with the rest of the world, it talks to other countries, it discusses with other countries, it maintains friendship with other countries. So this process is called diplomacy. Diplomat is a person engaged in this process. In India, we have the IFS officers, Indian Foreign Service Officers. They are mainly engaged in the process of diplomacy. That is why they are referred to as career diplomats. Mr. Jay Shankar, the current External Affairs Minister of India, he earlier served as a diplomat. He was an IFS officer. Before Mr. Jay Shankar, we had another individual who first worked as a diplomat and then became the External Affairs Minister of India. He was Mr. Natwar Singh. Right. We will study diplomacy in detail now. Okay. Diplomacy is the activity through which a country maintains relations with the rest of the world. Now, why should a country go for diplomacy? Now, the states of the world are distinct political units. They have their own sovereignty. Any state will try to ensure its own survival first. It will also try to achieve its self-interest. But at the same time, no country can survive on its own. It has to interact with other countries. It has to discuss various issues with other countries. For example, no country has enough resources to sustain itself. It has to take some natural resources from other countries. It has to go for trade. It has to export. It has to import. There will be movement of people between countries. Apart from this, all countries of the world have some common interests and goals. For example, overcoming poverty and achieving economic prosperity, technological development, ensuring peace in the world. These are common interests for all countries. So there is a need for countries of the world to talk with each other, discuss with each other. So diplomacy becomes necessary. Apart from this, there are also common challenges for all countries of the world. For example, tackling climate change is a common challenge. Tackling terrorism is a common challenge. Therefore, any country needs to interact with the rest of the world. So it is doing so through the activity called diplomacy. Okay. Now, diplomacy is not just an activity. Diplomacy is a science, an art. It is also a profession. Diplomacy is a science, it is an art, it is a profession. Many political philosophers have spoken about diplomacy. Many scholars have spoken about diplomacy in the ancient period. They did not use the word diplomacy, but they were talking about aspects which we call today in the name diplomacy. Take the ancient Indian political philosopher Kautilya, who is popularly known as Chanakya. In his book Arthashastra, he talks about diplomacy. He advises the king of a state, the ruler of a state. He tells the ruler of a state to maximize his power. He also tells the ruler of a state to increase the resources at hand. He also tells the ruler of a state to expand the territory if needed. And he advises the ruler of a state to tackle his enemy better. If needed, he should destroy his enemies. And he should also try to create friendship with many allies. So these can be achieved through the process called diplomacy. So we can see diplomacy as a science. As Kautilya mentioned, it should be carried out as an act. Whether you accept Kautilya's philosophy or not, diplomacy is seen as an art. It is also a profession. Got it? Now, when a country goes for diplomacy, it tries to influence the decisions and behavior of other states. By influencing the decisions and the behavior of other states, the home state is able to achieve its own interest and goals. And it is also able to resolve conflicts and issues. A country may have good friendship with another country. Even where there is a good friendship already existing, the country has to strengthen the friendship further. Even if there is an enmity, the country should talk with the other country. It should negotiate. It should deliberate. Only then it can resolve the issues and conflicts. So all these are achieved through diplomacy. So ultimately a country tries to achieve its interest and goals. Okay, let me explain with an example of how a country influences the behavior and the decision of other countries. I will explain this with an example. I am taking the example of India-US relations. Since diplomacy itself is based on the concept of state, we are taking two states, India and US. States are the basic units in international relations. It is the most important unit in international relation. A state is a distinct geographical and political unit. A state exhibits certain characteristics. It possesses sovereignty, it has territory, it has a government, it also has its own citizens. These are the important characteristics of a state. So state is a distinct physical unit as well as a political unit. Okay, now we are taking India-US relationship. India started diplomatic relations with US way back. We started the relationship after our independence. India-US relationship is characterized by friendship as well as frictions. India-US relationship has seen many highs and lows. Currently the relationship is at an all-time high. But in the past it has seen many lows. For example, a low was experienced in the year 1998. In the year 1998, India conducted its second nuclear test and we declared that we are a nuclear state. After India officially announced that it has become a nuclear state, many countries applied sanctions on India. One important country was US. US applied sanctions. Sanctions are a form of hard power. It is a punishment which a country imposes on another country. So how do you look at this sanction? The sanction is seen as a behavior, am I correct? It is also seen as a decision, right? So a country is influencing the behavior and the decision of another country. So India's testing of the nuclear weapons and announcement as a nuclear state is influencing the behavior and decision of US. So US decided to apply sanctions on India in the year 1998. We were still continuing with the relationship but US decided to apply sanctions on India. But nevertheless, India continued to work with US. US continued to look at India with suspicion. Nevertheless, we continued the sanctions. Okay. On the other hand, US is an imperial power. India was also keeping a watch on US. Now, everything changed in the year 2008. In a span of just 10 years, the relationship completely transformed. This was achieved by diplomacy. Our engagement with US, our interaction with US. So this later changed the behavior and the decision of US. In the year 2008, US signed a civil nuclear agreement with India called the 123 agreement. It is a civil nuclear agreement. Just 10 years back, it applied sanctions. Now, US itself is signing a nuclear agreement with India. India is not a member of NPT, Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. India is not a member of NSG. These are two important groups that work towards nuclear non-proliferation. Even though we are not a member of both these groups, US decided to sign an agreement with India because US saw India as a responsible nuclear state. In the year 2003, India released its nuclear doctrine. It clearly told the world why it developed its nuclear weapons. Through diplomacy, we told the world that our nuclear weapons were developed for our own security and for ensuring our own sovereignty and not for threatening or attacking any other state. So India won the trust of many countries including the US. So diplomacy helped India influence the behavior and the decision of US. So ultimately US started working closely with India later. Okay, so this is an example of how diplomacy can be used to influence other states. The word diplomacy was derived from the Greek term diplon. Diplon means folding into two. Similarly, the French term diplomate refers to a person engaged in diplomacy. In English, the term is diplomat. So, diplomate and diplomat are individuals who are authorized to conduct diplomacy. So, diplomacy basically means a twofold structure in which you are able to see an interaction. Okay. Diplomacy is based on the concept of state. As already seen, the states interact with each other. They are the basic units and the most important units in international relations. So, when you are able to see diplomacy, you are able to see the concept of state. So, the concept of state is seen here. The concept of state is observed. Now, when did diplomacy originate? Let's see. Diplomacy itself is an activity between states. So, diplomacy should have emerged when the concept of states emerged. Is it not? We were able to observe states many thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago, state existed in the form of kingdoms and empires. Today, you see modern states of the world. Today, you see modern nation state. But earlier, the states existed in different forms, in the form of mainly kingdoms and empires. Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire, Mongol Empire, and so on. The earliest evidence of diplomacy can be observed in ancient Egypt, way back in the 14th century BC, when the Egyptian kings called pharaohs conducted relations with other people, especially people in West Asia. So this is one of the earliest piece of evidence regarding diplomacy. In the modern period, diplomacy can be traced to the 17th century. 17th century is very important for political science and international relations. A very important development happened in the 17th century and 18th century. This was the Enlightenment. It happened in Europe. Enlightenment followed the Middle Ages in Europe. Middle Ages is the medieval period in Europe. During the Middle Age, the European society was feudal, it was backward, it was not secular. The society was characterized by social hierarchy. The religious institution, church, used to control the society. The king himself went by the directions of the church. So this was the nature of European society. Now slowly European society experienced certain changes. The first change was Renaissance. Renaissance gave importance to humanism. Earlier, man was seen as a means to an end. But later, through Renaissance, the concept of humanity was recognized. Now, man was seen as an end in himself. Later came Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. Enlightenment further built on the ideas of Renaissance. Enlightenment gave importance to individual happiness. Earlier, subordination of man was accepted as normal. Now, importance was given to the concept of mankind. Individual happiness is important. But this individual happiness is not just animalistic pleasure. So it was not pleasure as such. The individual happiness should be accompanied by knowledge also. Man should think. Man should be rational. So these are the important values obtained from Enlightenment. After Enlightenment, European society got transformed. It became progressive. It became modernized. It obtained values such as equality, fraternity, secularism, rule of law, and so on. Apart from Enlightenment, another important incident is very important. This is the Treaty of Westphalia, signed in the year 1648. In the 17th century, European countries fought with each other. They fought a devastating war called the 30 Years' War. Lakhs of people died in this war. Religion was also a factor, even though there were other factors. This war ended in a treaty of peace called Westphalia Treaty 1648. The Westphalia Treaty of 1648 greatly influenced the states. The concept of nationalism and the concept of state got strengthened in the 17th century, greatly influenced by the Treaty of Westphalia. So after the war, after the devastating war, the countries started recognizing the concept of national unity. So new states were consolidated and they became distinct political units. Okay. So the formation of states and the recognition of state as a concept in the modern period can be traced to the 17th century. Therefore, diplomacy as a major activity in the modern period can also be traced to the 17th century. We will now study the different forms of diplomacy. Before studying the 9 tracks of diplomacy, we will first look into the most important form of diplomacy. The basic and the most important form of diplomacy is official diplomacy. Official diplomacy is the formal, official process carried between one state with another. State A, state B. It is formal, it is official, it is connected by the state officials, it has backing of the state. State is the main actor. So state is the proactive player here. This is called official diplomacy. Another name for official diplomacy is track 1 diplomacy. If the foreign service officer from India talks with a foreign service officer with another country, we can call it as track 1 diplomacy. There's another form of diplomacy. This is called track 2 diplomacy. We will study this in detail next. Track 2 diplomacy is unofficial diplomacy. Track 2. It is carried through unofficial channels. It is also called back channel diplomacy. Unlike track 1 diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy is informal, unofficial. It is not conducted directly between the official apparatus of the state. It is conducted between members of the public in both the states. So this is called track 2 diplomacy. We can identify many examples of successful track 2 diplomacy. One very important example is the Dartmouth conference conducted between US and USSR. US and USSR were superpowers during the Cold War. They were also enemies. They influenced the entire world. They wanted to dominate each other. They waged proxy wars around the world. At the same time, they also went for diplomacy. The track 2 diplomacy was referred to as Dartmouth Conference. Dartmouth Conference started in 1960s and went on till 2010s. In fact, there is an attempt to revive the Dartmouth Conference between US and Russia today. Another example of successful track 2 diplomacy is the diplomacy between Palestine and Israel, which resulted in the Oslo Accord of 1993. Oslo Accord of 1993. Palestine and Israel were engaged in an ethnic and political conflict after 1948. You should be aware of this. The organization PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, was fighting against the state of Israel. It did not recognize the state of Israel. On the other side, Israel was looking at PLO as a terrorist organization. They were the biggest of enemies. But public diplomacy brought the two sides to the negotiating table. They agreed to peace finally in the year 1993. This is the Oslo Accord. Under the Oslo Accord, Israel agreed to accept the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. In turn, PLO agreed to stop fighting with Israel and take part in the government. This is a very important example of track 2 diplomacy. Armenia-Azerbaijan relationship have also been carried out using track 2 diplomacy. Armenia and Azerbaijan are fighting for a long period over the disputed region, Nagorno-Karabakh. These two states were engaging with each other under track 2 diplomacy for a very long period. Okay friends, I hope you now understood the concept of diplomacy in detail. We will now study the 9 tracks of diplomacy. We have already looked into track 1 diplomacy and track 2 diplomacy. There are 7 others forms of diplomacy, or we can say tracks of diplomacy. We will see what these are. We have a concept called multi-track diplomacy. As the name implies, it refers to different forms of diplomacy. Initially, countries were going for only the first track diplomacy, official channels. But this official channel of diplomacy was found to be ineffective. It was unable to solve many problems. There was lack of trust. Take the example of relations between US and USSR. They were the greatest of enemies during the Cold War. Naturally, there won't be much trust when they go for track 1 diplomacy. Even when the officials talk with each other, they will be considering each other as enemies. So, this slowly led to the track 2 diplomacy. So, scholars felt the need for an interpersonal approach. Interpersonal approach was needed, was felt. They felt that it would be better if there was a personal interaction. It was felt it would be better if the people in different countries talked with each other. It was felt it would be better if one country learns about the other country. So this is how track 2 diplomacy emerged. Secondly, apart from states, you have non-state actors in the world also. For example, there are many terrorist groups. They are non-state actors. Now, track 1 diplomacy may not be successful between a state and a non-state actor. At times it may be successful, but it may not be successful at all times. Now, what is the solution? The solution will be track 2 diplomacy. I already gave the example of Israel-Palestine track 2 diplomacy. Israel was a state, PLO was a non-state actor, is it not? Earlier, it was difficult to go for track 1 diplomacy, but track 2 diplomacy increased the trust. It went for interpersonal interaction, and ultimately it succeeded and led to the Oslo Accord of 1993. Secondly, there may be conflicts within the state itself, interstate conflict. Here also track 1 diplomacy may not work. So track 2 diplomacy will be the solution. Take our country India. There are many separatist groups in India, in regions such as Northeast, Kashmir and in the Red Corridor. Separatist and insurgent groups. When the Indian state tries to talk with these people, many of these groups may refuse to talk. Now, it will be better if you go for track 2 diplomacy. We can go for back channel diplomacy. So this will be much better. Trust will be higher. Both the parties will understand each other's demand better. We can come up with better practical solutions. The individual Joseph Montville, he first introduced the concept track 2 diplomacy. He was a former diplomat. You can note down his name. So Joseph Montville gave a new dimension to diplomacy. The track 2 diplomacy is referred to as back channel diplomacy. It is unofficial, it is informal, it involves persons from civil society, it can involve persons from arts background, sports background, you can involve human rights activists, you can involve teachers, you can involve anyone literally apart from the state. Okay? So the important features here are it is unofficial, it is informal, it is conducted between private parties and state not involved. India and Pakistan are trying to establish the Kartarpur corridor. The Kartarpur corridor connects India with Pakistan. Pilgrims from both countries can visit the other country. They can visit the holy shrines, mosques, and gurudwaras. This is an example of track 2 diplomacy. The Wagah border ceremony, which is conducted each day itself, can be seen as track 2 diplomacy. Most of us focus only on the marching of the soldiers, but before the marching, the people on both sides, the civilians, they come together. So this naturally creates a friendship. It brings in trust. Okay, so this is how we go for track 2 diplomacy. Sometimes track 1 and track 2 diplomacy can be combined. This is referred to as track 1.5 diplomacy. Many scholars don't use the term 1.5 diplomacy officially, but we can practically go for such a diplomacy, which is a mixture of government-led diplomacy and non-government-led diplomacy. India-Pakistan relationship is characterized by 1.5 diplomacy, we can say. Apart from official channels, we also go for back channel diplomacy. We use sports to build trust between India and Pakistan. We use cinema and arts to build trust between India and Pakistan. You have human rights activists on both sides who discuss with each other. You have environmentalist activists on both sides who discuss with each other. Climate change is a common challenge for both India and Pakistan. The Indus River flows in both India and Pakistan. It emerges in Himalayas. Now, protecting the Himalayas from the challenges of climate change is a responsibility for both India and Pakistan. So, India and Pakistan can work together in a friendly manner for many common goals and interests. So, here it would be better if you go for a combination of the two tracks of diplomacy. So, this can be seen as 1.5 track diplomacy. Official plus unofficial. Okay friends, now we will study the 7 other tracks of diplomacy. The 9 tracks of diplomacy overall were put forward by 2 important scholars. John MacDonald, a former diplomat, and Dr. Louis Diamond. So 9 tracks of diplomacy attributed to these 2 scholars. They started an institution called IMTD, Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. IMTD was jointly founded by John MacDonald and Dr. Louis Diamond. So they gave this term called multi-track diplomacy, under which they put forward 9 tracks of diplomacy. So they actually enriched the concept of diplomacy, we can say, by putting forward many other forms of diplomacy. In the year 1991, both these scholars expanded the number of tracks to 9. We will now look into the 7 other tracks of diplomacy. I will explain with examples. Track 3 diplomacy. This is related to business and trade. Okay. For example, India and US work with each other under many economic platforms. Financial partnership, economic partnership, India-US Trade Policy Forum, and so on. An example of track 3 diplomacy. The former Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, started important transport networks that connected India with Pakistan. An example of track 3 diplomacy. Even though India and China have many problems, India and China continue with bilateral trade. The volume of bilateral trade between India and China exceeds $100 billion. So we take many initiatives to build relationship with another country using business and trade. So all these initiatives come under track 3 diplomacy. China's BRI project, Belt and Road Initiative, can be classified under track 3 diplomacy. There's a project called AAGC, Africa Asia Growth Corridor, a joint project of India and Japan. India and Japan are working under AAGC to build infrastructure projects in Africa. So all these are seen as engagements through economic partnership, business and trade. Next is track 4. Track 4 involves personal interaction. Between countries. So this is personal. It increases the trust even between two countries which fight with each other. For example, even though US and China had enmity during the Cold War, the President Nixon visited China. So this was very surprising to the entire world. Nixon even came to India. He met then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. But at the time, Nixon was not very happy with India because India was raising its voice against the Cold War politics. It was bravely raising its voice against the imperialism of US. Anyway, Nixon went to India. Nixon also went to China. He wanted to build trust with both these countries. He had an intention to build a good relationship with both countries. But ultimately, it did not succeed much with India. This is track 4 diplomacy. Track 5 diplomacy involves education, research and training. Track 5, education, research and training. International Solar Alliance, headquartered in India, brings in countries so that they can develop technology with respect to solar power. An example of track 5 diplomacy. India and Israel are jointly working in various areas like agriculture, dry farming, seawater purification and so on. Example of track 5 diplomacy. India is using the Nalanda University and many other educational centers to build good relations with other countries. We invite students from the neighborhood. Example of track 5 diplomacy. Next is track 6. Track 6 is through activism. Activism and advocacy. You can see countries engaging with each other for many common values, goals and interests like human rights, LGBT rights, environmental protection and so on. For example, Aung San Suu Kyi, the pro-democracy leader in Myanmar, earlier used to interact with India. Here the activism is related to democracy. The activism was related to human rights of people living in the states of India as well as Myanmar. An example of track 6 diplomacy. Track 7 is related to religion. For example, Organization of Islamic Countries, OIC, brings many Muslim countries of the world together. It ensures cooperation. Here, religion is used for constructive purposes. Kartarpur corridor between India and Pakistan is an example of track 7 diplomacy. India's Buddhist tourism corridor, under which Buddhism is used as a form of soft power, is an example of track 7. Next is track 8. Track 8 is related to funding and providing resources. India in the past obtained financial assistance from many countries. In the 1950s and 60s, we were much backward. Japan was one important state that provided official development assistance to India. This is a form of track 8 diplomacy. Today, India helps many other countries. The recent past, we helped countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, which faced economic crisis. We gave loans and grants to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Gujarat Doctrine, a set of foreign policy principles put forward by former External Affairs Minister of India, Gujarat, who later became the Prime Minister of India. The Gujarat Doctrine tells that India should try to help small neighboring countries as much as possible without expecting anything in return. In fact, the recent help provided by India to Sri Lanka as well as Bangladesh follows the wisdom of Gujarat Doctrine. So all these can be classified under track 8 diplomacy. Last is track 9. Track 9 is related to communication, media and information. Countries will try to showcase their values, showcase their cultural principles, and showcase their achievements to the world through media. The External Affairs Ministry has a dedicated publicity division through which it publicizes India's initiatives. An example of track 9 diplomacy. International Yoga Day conducted by India is an example of track 9. We use communication media to showcase our values to the rest of the world. Another important example is Pravasya Bharatiya Divas. Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, a ceremony conducted every 2 years under which we recognize and felicitate the Indian diaspora living across the world. This is also an example of track 9 diplomacy. So these are the 9 tracks of diplomacy. Diplomacy itself comes under soft power. Soft power is opposed to hard power. When a country uses force or coercion on another country to achieve its interest or goals, it is called hard power. Soft power is the opposite. It does not use any force. No force or violence is involved. This is called soft power. We can use many elements under soft power. Culture can be used for soft power. The traditional values of a country can be used for soft power. Education can be used. Technological collaboration can be used. Tourism can be used. Sports can be used. Literally anything can be used as long as it is constructive. As long as two countries are willing to work with each other in a friendly manner without any force or coercion, it can be called soft power. Diplomacy itself comes under soft power. Don't forget, diplomacy itself comes under the larger concept of soft power. But within diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy has more scope for soft power. Okay? Earlier countries mainly used hard power in the ancient period and later in the medieval period. Today countries don't use hard power, they go for soft power. Even where there is an existing issue or a conflict, countries first try to use the soft power. Only when all avenues are exhausted, they will choose hard power. So soft power is a very important tool in international relations. Under soft power, diplomacy is a very important tool. Diplomacy helps a country secure its interest. It also helps a country interact with the rest of the world and influence the behavior and decisions of other states. It also helps a country work with the rest of the world to achieve common goals and interests and tackle common challenges better. I hope this session is of help to you. Thank you.